The rain drummed softly against the windows as Daniel sat alone in his living room, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His fingers traced the edges of 2 photographs resting in his lap. One of his late wife, Claire, her smile forever frozen in time, and the other a grainy black-and-white ultrasound of the child they had never gotten the chance to meet. His thumb brushed against Claire's face, remembering the way her laughter used to fill this house, how her eyes crinkled at the corners whenever she smiled. The silence around him felt suffocating, pressing against his chest with an unbearable weight. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. Setting the photos aside, Daniel crossed the room and opened the door to find his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, standing on the porch, a plate of warm cookies in her hands. "Thought you could use a little something sweet," she said with a gentle smile, stepping inside when he moved aside to let her in. Her gaze fell to the photographs on the coffee table, and her expression softened. "I was volunteering at the community center yesterday," she began, easing herself into the armchair by the fireplace. "They had an adoption fair, so many wonderful children looking for homes." Daniel let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. "I appreciate the thought, Mrs. Holloway, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that." She didn't push, simply nodding in understanding. But after she left, her words lingered in his mind, refusing to be ignored. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. The weight of solitude pressed heavier on his shoulders, and for the first time in years, he found himself considering a future different from the one he had resigned himself to. 2 weeks later, he found himself standing just inside the entrance of the adoption fair, feeling more out of place than ever. Cheerful decorations brightened the walls, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the room. Couples moved through the space, talking with social workers and meeting children, the air thick with hopeful anticipation. "First time here?" A warm voice pulled him from his thoughts. Turning, he found himself face to face with a woman who looked to be in her early 40s. Her kind brown eyes filled with understanding. She extended her hand. "I'm Ms. Reynolds, one of the caseworkers here." "Daniel Carter," he replied, shaking her hand. "And yeah, first time." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Let me show you around." As they walked through the fair, she explained the different adoption processes, outlining the steps he would need to take. Then, her expression turned more serious. "There's a special case I'd like to discuss with you." Curious, Daniel followed her gaze toward the far corner of the room, where 5 girls sat together. The oldest, tall and composed at 14, kept a watchful eye on the others while pretending to read a book. Next to her, a 12-year-old sketched quietly in a notebook, occasionally offering a soft smile to the toddler beside her. A quiet 10-year-old sat slightly apart, observing everything with cautious eyes, while a 5-year-old bounced on her heels, her boundless energy making the others grin despite themselves. "That's Emma," Ms. Reynolds said, gesturing toward the eldest. Then Sophia with the sketchbook, Lily, who tends to keep to herself, Hazel, the energetic one, and little Daisy. Something about them made Daniel pause. He noticed the way Emma positioned herself like a shield between her sisters and the rest of the room, the way Sophia gently guided Daisy's small hand as she colored, the way Hazel clung to Lily's arm as if seeking silent reassurance. They weren't just sisters. They were a unit, bound together by something deeper than mere family ties. Ms. Reynolds arranged a brief meeting. The girls sat politely, but their eyes held an unmistakable wariness. Emma's gaze, sharp and unyielding, met his directly. "Why would you want all of us?" she asked bluntly. The question hit Daniel harder than he expected. He looked at each of them, the protective stance of the eldest, the quiet strength of the second, the hidden pain in the third, the nervous energy of the fourth, and the innocent trust of the youngest. "Because you belong together," he answered simply. That evening, as he signed the initial paperwork, Ms. Reynolds offered a word of caution. "They've been through a lot. Multiple placements, separations. There will be challenges, trust issues, possibly trauma responses." Daniel watched the girls as they walked away, their formation instinctively tight, as though the world itself might pull them apart at any moment. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something other than grief, a purpose. The morning sun barely peeked through the kitchen windows when chaos erupted. Hazel stood in the middle of the room, her small fists clenched, frustration written all over her face. Hazel stood in the middle of the room, her small fists clenched, frustration written all over her face. "I don't want these shoes," she wailed, tears streaking her cheeks. "They feel wrong." At the table, Daisy stared stubbornly at her untouched bowl of cereal, lips pressed into a firm, silent protest. Daniel moved between them, trying to manage both situations while keeping an eye on the toaster. "Hazel, sweetheart, those are the ones we picked out together," he reasoned, forcing patience into his tone. A thick, acrid smell filled the air. "Oh no." Black smoke curled from the toaster. Daniel rushed to unplug it, nearly colliding with Sophia as she entered the kitchen. The burnt toast popped up, completely ruined. "Lily needs her lunch." Emma's voice came from the doorway, arms crossed. Daniel's stomach sank. The lunchbox. He had forgotten to pack it the night before. "I'll make something quick," he promised, but his hands shook slightly as he opened the fridge. By the time they were all out the door, Daniel's shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his nerves frayed. The girls moved around him with careful distance, only accepting his help when absolutely necessary. That afternoon, Mrs. Holloway appeared at his door once again, her ever-present plate of cookies in hand. Her gaze swept over the backpacks scattered in the entryway, the disarray of the house. "Quite a morning from what I could hear," she remarked gently as she stepped inside. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "That obvious, huh?" She settled into a chair, her expression thoughtful. "I noticed something today," she said after a moment. "When you were getting them into the car, they flinched when that truck backfired down the street. And little Hazel, she didn't just jump, she looked terrified." Daniel exhaled slowly. "They've been through a lot in foster care," he said, though her words sent a pang of unease through him. "Perhaps," Mrs. Holloway mused. "But there's fear in their eyes, Daniel. A fear that runs deeper than just adjusting to a new home." That evening, determined to bring some normalcy, Daniel took Hazel and Daisy to the park. He watched as they hesitated near the playground, their small bodies tense with uncertainty. Then, across the street, a dog barked. Hazel froze. Her tiny frame trembled as she pressed herself against Daniel's leg. "I want to go home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, can we go home?" Daniel knelt beside her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. But she wouldn't look at him. Later that night, as he tucked the girls into bed, he lingered in the hallway, listening. Through the crack in their door, he heard Emma's voice, soft but firm. "We're safe here." A pause. "For now." Daniel's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right, and whatever it was just beginning. The house was quiet, but Daniel couldn't shake the weight pressing against his chest. Emma's words echoed in his mind. "We're safe here, for now." He sat in the living room, a cup of tea growing cold in his hands, staring at the darkened windows. The girls were asleep upstairs, or at least he hoped they were. Something about the way Emma had spoken made him doubt that any of them ever truly rested. As he finally pushed himself up to go to bed, movement caught his eye. A shadow shifted near the back fence. His breath hitched, and for a moment, he stood frozen. He wasn't imagining it. Someone had been there. By the time he stepped outside, the yard was empty. The wind rustled through the trees, the night air cool against his skin. But he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. Shutting the door firmly behind him, he double-checked the locks before heading upstairs. He stopped by the girls' rooms, listening carefully. From inside, the soft whisper of Emma's voice filtered through the door. "If she finds us, we run." Daniel's grip tightened on the doorknob, his heart pounding. He knocked gently. The whispering stopped immediately. A few seconds later, Emma's voice, calm and controlled, called out, "Come in." When Daniel stepped inside, he found the girls arranged in their beds with forced casualness. Melody sat cross-legged, sketchbook in hand. Lily clutched a stuffed cat to her chest, and Hazel was half buried under her blanket. Daisy lay curled up at the edge of the bed, her tiny body stiff. "Everything okay in here?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice light. Emma nodded. "Just telling stories before bed." "What kind of stories?" "Princesses and stuff." The other girls remained silent, following Emma's lead. Daniel hesitated before gesturing for Emma to step into the hallway. She did, reluctantly, closing the door partway behind her. "You can tell me if something's wrong," he said softly, keeping his voice gentle. "I just want to help." Emma's fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve, her posture rigid. For a moment, her mask cracked, just enough for him to see the fear beneath it. "She's gone," she whispered. "She can't hurt us anymore." Daniel's chest tightened. "Who?" Emma's expression immediately shut down. "No one," she said quickly. "It's nothing. We're fine." Before he could press further, she slipped back inside the room and shut the door firmly. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his thoughts racing. Whatever the girls had been through, whatever past they were running from, it wasn't over. Lying in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, he made a silent promise. "I'll find out the truth. And I'll make sure they never have to run again." The next evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Daniel sat at the dining room table, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, adoption records, case files, behavioral reports, everything he had been given about the girls. It wasn't much. Most of the pages contained generic information, previous foster placements, school history, medical records. But then, buried at the bottom of the stack, he found a heavily redacted document. Large portions of the text were blacked out, leaving only fragments visible. And in the middle of all the obscured information, one name stood out: Charlotte Haynes. Beneath it, in bold red letters, "Do not contact. Danger to minors." A cold chill ran through Daniel's veins. His grip on the paper tightened. He grabbed his laptop and quickly typed the name into a search engine. Nothing. No news articles, no social media accounts. Just random profiles that didn't match what he was looking for. It was like she had been erased. The lack of information only made him more uneasy. Over the next few days, he began watching the girls more closely. Small things started to stand out. Things he hadn't fully noticed before. Melody's usually bright, colorful drawings had taken a darker turn. One night, as she sat sketching at the coffee table, Daniel glanced over her shoulder. Her latest picture showed 5 small figures huddled together, a dark shadow looming over them. The faces were marked with tiny, frightened tears. When he asked about it, Melody quickly flipped the paper over and started a new drawing. Emma had grown even more vigilant. She checked the locks every night, triple-checking the windows before bed. If a car passed by too slowly outside, she would tense, her eyes darting toward the front door. Hazel clung to his old firefighter jacket, refusing to go anywhere without it. The heavy material dragged behind her as she walked, but she wouldn't let go, not even to eat. Lily avoided the backyard entirely. "I don't like how it feels out there," she whispered when Daniel encouraged her to get some fresh air. She pressed herself against the kitchen wall, arms wrapped tightly around herself. And then Daisy started waking up in the middle of the night, crying for no reason. Daniel knew without a doubt that something had happened to them. Something terrible. But before he could figure out what, something happened that made everything worse. It was late one night when Daniel went to check the locks before heading to bed. As he reached for the deadbolt, something outside caught his eye. A white envelope sticking out of the mailbox. His stomach dropped. Mail didn't come this late. He stepped outside, the cool night air sending a shiver down his spine. Retrieving the envelope, he turned it over in his hands. There was no address, no stamp. Just a single piece of paper inside. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were 6 words: "You took what belongs to me." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His hands clenched around the paper, rage and fear curling in his chest. Charlotte. This had to be from her. He scanned the street, but everything was still. No sign of movement, no unfamiliar cars. For the first time since adopting the girls, true fear settled into his bones. The next morning, Daniel wasted no time. He called a security company and had them install cameras around the house, every entrance, every blind spot. High-definition feeds connected to his phone, allowing him to monitor the property at all times. A locksmith arrived shortly after, replacing every lock with a top-of-the-line electronic system. Each of the older girls received their own unique entry code. Motion sensor lights were installed along the perimeter, ensuring that no one could approach the house unnoticed. The threatening note stayed hidden in his desk drawer, but the tension in the house was impossible to conceal. Emma watched him warily as he double-checked the new locks before bedtime. Hazel refused to sleep without the hallway light on. Melody's drawings grew even darker. Daniel stayed up late that night, staring at the security feeds on his laptop, scanning the screens for any sign of movement. His hands hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed the name again. Charlotte Haynes, criminal record. The results sent a chill through him. Multiple arrests, petty theft, fraud, assault. Then, buried among the old reports, he found something worse. A news article. Mother attempts to sell children for drug money. Daniel's blood ran cold as he read. Charlotte had tried to sell her daughters to pay off a debt. His stomach turned. The thought of Emma, Melody, Lily, Hazel, and Daisy in the hands of strangers, sold like property, made his hands tremble. He closed his laptop, his jaw tightening. She wasn't just dangerous. She was a monster. And now, she knew where they were. Daniel sat in the dark, his fingers drumming against the desk as he stared at the laptop screen. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the revelation sinking deep into his bones. Charlotte Haynes. The name alone made his stomach turn. The articles he had found painted a picture of a woman who was not just unfit, but dangerous. Her criminal record stretched back years: petty theft, fraud, multiple assault charges. But it was the attempted sale of her own children that left him reeling. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. He needed to stay calm, think rationally. Turning back to his laptop, he opened a folder and began saving every piece of information he could find. Screenshots of court records, news articles, old police reports, anything that could help if she ever tried to come near the girls again. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. How much did Emma know? Was this why she had been so guarded? Had she seen the worst of her mother firsthand? A deep sense of anger burned in his chest, but it wasn't just anger. It was something more dangerous, something protective. He wasn't just angry for them. He was ready to fight for them. That night, sleep barely came. Every time he closed his eyes, images of the girls' fearful expressions haunted him. By morning, he had made a decision. After dropping the girls off at school, Daniel drove straight to the adoption agency. Ms. Reynolds greeted him in her office, a concerned expression crossing her face when he sat down. "I need to know everything about Charlotte Haynes," he said, his voice firm. Ms. Reynolds hesitated. "Daniel, that information is highly restricted. She found us," he interrupted, placing the unmarked envelope on the desk. "She left this in my mailbox. I need to know how much of a threat she is." Ms. Reynolds picked up the note, her face paling as she read the message. "Damn it," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "I was afraid of this." "What do you know?" Daniel pressed. She sighed, leaning forward. "We weren't allowed to include much in the adoption paperwork because of confidentiality laws, but Charlotte Haynes lost custody of the girls years ago. She was deemed a severe risk, violent, manipulative, completely unstable. After she was arrested for attempting to sell them, she disappeared. No known address, no activity under her name." Daniel clenched his fists. So why now? Why come back after all this time? Ms. Reynolds hesitated, then lowered her voice. There were rumors that she was trying to find them. She believes they still belong to her. Daniel's stomach turned. She can't have them, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Ms. Reynolds met his gaze. Legally, no. But Charlotte doesn't follow the law. She's dangerous, Daniel. You need to be careful. Daniel stood, grabbing the note from her desk. I'm not just going to be careful, I'm going to be prepared. The next few days passed in a haze of tension. The security cameras were up and running, the new locks were in place, but none of it eased the feeling that something was lurking just beyond his reach. Then, the disturbances began. It started small. Tuesday morning, Daniel found the backyard gate open. He distinctly remembered locking it the night before. Wednesday, Harper's beloved stuffed rabbit vanished without a trace. She sobbed for hours, convinced it had been taken. Thursday, he found muddy footprints by the back door, prints that didn't match his or the girl's shoes. Emma became even more withdrawn, her eyes darting toward the windows every time she heard a noise outside. Melody barely spoke, burying herself in her drawings. Lily refused to leave the house, while Hazel started waking up in the middle of the night screaming. And then, Friday night, the girls' fears became Daniel's reality. It was late, long after the girls had gone to bed. Daniel was in his office, scrolling through the security feeds when movement flickered across the screen. A figure, at the edge of the yard. His blood ran cold. Whoever it was stood completely still, just beyond the reach of the motion-activated floodlights. Their presence sent a deep, primal sense of dread through Daniel's body. He stood quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he moved to the back door. He flicked on the porch light and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the scent of damp earth filling his nostrils. His eyes scanned the yard, but whoever had been there was gone. But something wasn't right. A small object lay on the back porch, barely visible in the dim light. Daniel crouched down, his hands tightening into fists when he saw what it was. A stuffed rabbit. Harper's missing toy. His hands shook as he picked it up, his mind racing. Someone had been in his yard. Someone had taken this from inside his home and left it as a message. Daniel turned on his heel and marched inside, locking the door behind him. He checked the security feeds again, rewinding the footage. And then, he saw her. A woman standing just at the edge of the yard, her dark hair wild, her face gaunt and shadowed. Her eyes burned with something unhinged, something dangerous. Charlotte. Daniel's chest tightened with fury. She had found them, and she wasn't going to stop. That night, he stayed awake, sitting by the front door with a baseball bat in his hands. He wouldn't let her near them. Not ever. The next morning, he gathered the girls in the living room. Emma sat with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Melody clutched her sketchbook, while Lily, Hazel, and Daisy huddled together on the couch. Daniel took a deep breath. I need to talk to you all about something. The girls exchanged glances. I know you're scared, he continued, and I know you've been through a lot, but I need you to trust me. He looked directly at Emma. I know about Charlotte. The room went silent. Emma's body tensed. She's gone, she said stiffly. She can't hurt us anymore. Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. She was in our yard last night. Lily let out a small gasp, while Hazel clutched Daisy's hand tightly. Melody's eyes filled with tears. She found us? Daniel nodded. But listen to me. You are safe. She can't take you away. I won't let her. Emma's expression wavered for the first time. That's what the last family said, she whispered. Daniel's stomach sank. I'm not the last family. He leaned forward, his voice firm. She doesn't own you. She never did. You are mine now, and I will do whatever it takes to protect you. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, Daisy crawled into his lap, pressing her tiny face against his chest. I don't want her to take us, she murmured. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. She won't. Emma's face was unreadable, but something in her eyes softened. For the first time since he had met them, she nodded. Daniel knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, the girls weren't facing it alone. The house felt different after that conversation. Tighter, quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Daniel could see the change in the girls, how their movements became more cautious. Emma watched the doors constantly, her muscles always tense like she was waiting to hear a sound that would send her running. Melody spent more time drawing, but now her sketches were filled with jagged shadows, faceless figures lurking just beyond reach. Lily stayed close to the younger girls, as if standing between them and an unseen threat. Hazel, normally so full of energy, started refusing to go outside at all. And Daisy, sweet little Daisy, wouldn't let go of Daniel's hand unless absolutely necessary. Daniel had always known parenting would be difficult, but this was something else entirely. The security cameras became his lifeline. He checked them constantly, scanning for any sign of Charlotte, any flicker of movement outside the house. Days passed. Then a week. No notes, no footprints, no stolen toys, nothing. It should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. The silence felt like a storm waiting to break. Then, one night, it did. Daniel was in his office when the alert pinged his phone. Motion detected. Front porch. His heart pounded as he clicked on the live feed. And there she was. Charlotte. Standing on his front steps, her face illuminated by the porch light. She was thinner than in the photos he had found, her features sharp, almost hollow. But her eyes burned with something unhinged, something dark. She stared directly into the camera, and then, slowly, she smiled. Daniel shot to his feet. His pulse thundered in his ears as he rushed to the front door. He didn't know what he was going to do. Yell, threaten, call the police. But when he threw the door open, the porch was empty. She was gone. But she had been there. She had wanted him to see her. He stepped outside, scanning the yard, the street. Nothing. The neighborhood was still, eerily silent. Then, movement near the bushes. A rustling sound. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I know you're there." No response. He took a step forward. "Stay away from my family." Still nothing. His fists clenched. He wanted to run after her, to drag her to the police himself, but he knew that wasn't the answer. He couldn't leave the house unguarded. With one last look into the darkness, he turned back inside, locking the door behind him. He barely slept that night. The next morning, he called Ms. Reynolds again. "I need to file a restraining order," he said as soon as she picked up. "Immediately." Ms. Reynolds sighed. "Daniel, I understand your fear, but without concrete proof." "I have security footage," he cut in. "She was at my house last night, staring into my cameras like she was daring me to do something." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, finally, "I'll see what I can do." That evening, he sat Emma down. "Has Charlotte ever tried to take you before?" Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Once. We were with a foster family and she found us. She tried to convince them she was getting custody back soon, but they didn't believe her." She swallowed hard. "She came back a few nights later, tried to break in. The dad scared her off before she could get inside." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "Did you tell anyone?" She shrugged. "They moved us after that, said it was for our safety, but it didn't stop her from trying again later." Daniel clenched his jaw. She wasn't going to stop, not unless someone made her, and if no one else would, then he would. That night, he set an alert on his phone, notifying him if the cameras picked up any movement outside. At 2:37 a.m., the alert went off. Daniel bolted upright, grabbing his phone. Motion detected. Side gate. He pulled up the feed. The screen flickered for a second before the image cleared. Charlotte. She was trying to open the gate, jiggling the latch with slow, deliberate movements. His blood ran cold. Then, something even worse. She wasn't alone. A man stood behind her, his face partially obscured by shadows. Taller than her, broad-shouldered. Daniel's mind raced. Who was he? Someone helping her? A threat? His heart pounded as he reached for the phone, dialing 911. The moment the operator answered, Daniel kept his voice low but firm. "There's someone trying to break into my house. I have it on camera right now." The dispatcher immediately assured him officers were on their way. Daniel kept watching the screen. Charlotte whispered something to the man, then pointed toward the house. The air in the room felt suffocating. Then, suddenly, the motion lights flared to life. Charlotte flinched, stepping back. The man jerked his head toward the street, and just like that, they ran, disappeared into the night. But they had tried. They had tried. Daniel stayed by the front door, baseball bat in hand, until the police arrived. By then, the yard was empty. No sign of Charlotte or the man she had been with. The officers reviewed the footage, took his statement, and promised to file a report. But Daniel knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, he sat with the girls, telling them as gently as he could that Charlotte had come back. He expected panic, tears, but instead he saw something else. Resignation. They had been through this before. Emma straightened her shoulders. "She won't stop." Daniel met her gaze. "Neither will I." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Then, finally, she nodded. And just like that, something shifted. For the first time, she wasn't carrying the weight alone. Daniel knew the battle wasn't over. But now, they were fighting it together. 2 days later, the restraining order was officially approved. Police patrols increased in the area. Security footage was sent to the authorities, creating a record of Charlotte's harassment. And then, just when they thought things might finally settle, a phone call. Ms. Reynolds. "Daniel, we found her." Daniel's breath caught. "Where?" "She was arrested last night," Ms. Reynolds said. "She tried to break into a different foster home. The police caught her." Relief crashed over Daniel so fast he had to sit down. "She's not getting out this time," Ms. Reynolds continued. "Her record is too long. She violated too many laws. This is it." Daniel exhaled, pressing a hand to his forehead. It was over. Charlotte was gone. That night, when he told the girls, there were no celebrations, no cheers, just quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not fear, not uncertainty. Something lighter. Something like peace. Emma didn't check the locks that night. Melody's drawings returned to their usual colors. Lily sat outside in the backyard watching the sunset. Hazel played with Daisy, giggling as they chased each other around the house. And Daniel? Daniel finally let himself breathe. Because for the first time in a long time, they weren't just surviving. They were safe. They were home. And that was everything. Ethan held Ava tightly, his hand resting protectively on her back as she trembled against him. He could feel the tension in her small frame, the way she held herself together despite the weight of everything she had just testified to. "You did amazing," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ava nodded against his chest but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The exhaustion in her body said enough. Behind them, Charlotte's lawyer straightened his tie and turned to his client, whispering something in a low, urgent tone. Charlotte sat rigidly, her jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. Her eyes bore into Ava's back, a mixture of rage and something else. Something unreadable. Ethan caught the look and instinctively stepped in front of Ava, shielding her from Charlotte's gaze. Ms. Bennett gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We're almost there," she murmured. "But we're not done yet." The judge had called for a brief recess, allowing both parties time to regroup. Ethan led Ava out into the hallway, where the rest of the girls were waiting with Mrs. Ellison. The moment Harper saw Ava's face, she ran forward and grabbed her sister's hand. "You okay?" Ava nodded, though her grip on Harper's fingers tightened. Melody, Lily, and Rose hovered nearby, their expressions a mix of worry and admiration. "She was so brave," Melody whispered to Olivia. Ethan placed a gentle hand on Ava's shoulder. "You don't have to go back in if you don't want to," he told her. Ava hesitated, then shook her head. "I want to stay." Ethan wasn't surprised. Ava had spent her whole life protecting her sisters. She wouldn't back down now. When they re-entered the courtroom, Charlotte was already seated, her expression carefully blank. But Ethan could see the tightness in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed anxiously against the table. Ms. Bennett stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Dr. Amanda Ross to the stand." A woman in her early 50s, dressed in a crisp navy blazer, took the stand and was sworn in. Dr. Ross was one of the leading child psychologists in the state and had been working closely with the girls for months. "Dr. Ross," Ms. Bennett began, "can you summarize your findings regarding the Haynes children?" Dr. Ross adjusted her glasses and folded her hands in her lap. All 5 girls exhibit clear signs of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Their experiences with their biological mother have left them deeply scarred, both emotionally and psychologically. Each of them has developed different coping mechanisms. Ava with hypervigilance, Melody with artistic expression, Olivia with emotional withdrawal, Harper with attachment issues, and Rose with regression behaviors. And based on your professional opinion, would it be in their best interest to be reunited with their biological mother? Charlotte's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! Leading the witness!" The judge gave him a sharp look. "Overruled. Dr. Ross may answer." Dr. Ross didn't hesitate. "Absolutely not." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. "These children have finally begun to heal in a safe, stable environment," she continued. "Removing them from Mr. Carter's care would be detrimental to their progress. Furthermore, reintroducing them to Ms. Haynes, given her past abusive behavior, would put them at significant psychological risk." Charlotte scoffed loudly, shaking her head. Dr. Ross turned her gaze to her. "Ms. Haynes, have you ever once acknowledged the pain you've caused your daughters? Or have you only thought about what you've lost?" Charlotte's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to respond, but no words came. Ms. Bennett nodded, satisfied. "No further questions." Charlotte's lawyer stood. "Dr. Ross, are you saying that people can't change? That my client, who has undergone extensive therapy, does not deserve a second chance?" Dr. Ross met his gaze evenly. "People can change, but change does not erase the consequences of their past actions. Ms. Haynes may be improving as an individual, but that does not mean she has earned the right to be a mother again." Charlotte's lawyer seemed to struggle for a rebuttal but finally sighed. "No further questions." The judge turned her attention to Charlotte. "Ms. Haynes, you may take the stand." Charlotte stood slowly, smoothing her dress before walking to the witness stand. As she was sworn in, her eyes briefly flickered toward the girls. When she spoke, her voice was softer than anyone expected. "I was a bad mother," she admitted. "I know that." A murmur spread through the courtroom. "I was broken," she continued. "I was angry, and I took it out on them." She swallowed hard. "But I have changed. I have spent the last 2 years trying to become a better person. I have done everything the courts have asked of me. I have completed every program, every therapy session. I just want a chance to be in their lives again." Ms. Bennett stood, arms folded. "Ms. Haynes, are you truly seeking what's best for your daughters, or are you seeking redemption for yourself?" Charlotte faltered. Ms. Bennett pressed forward. "You say you've changed, yet you still sent threatening letters to Mr. Carter's home. You trespassed on his property. You terrified your children. If you truly wanted what was best for them, why would you do that?" Charlotte's expression darkened. "Because they were taken from me," she snapped, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Ms. Bennett's lips curved into a knowing smile. "And there it is. Charlotte realized her mistake too late. "You still believe they belong to you?" Ms. Bennet continued. "Not that they are individuals with their own needs, their own rights, but that they are possessions to be reclaimed." Charlotte's breathing quickened. Ms. Bennet turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I rest my case." The judge exhaled, rubbing her temples. "We will reconvene tomorrow for the final ruling. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck, but Charlotte didn't move. She sat there, hands clenched in her lap, her body rigid. Ethan gathered the girls quickly, ushering them toward the exit. He wanted them as far from her as possible. As they stepped into the hallway, Harper tugged at his sleeve. "She still looks mad," she whispered. Ethan didn't respond. He just pulled her close, walking them toward the courthouse exit, hoping, praying, that tomorrow would finally bring them peace. The night before the final ruling, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The usual hum of evening activity had been replaced with a thick, uneasy silence. The girls moved through the house cautiously, as if afraid to break the stillness. Ava lingered near the kitchen table, absent-mindedly twisting the chain of her necklace around her fingers. Melody sat on the couch, her sketchbook open but untouched. Olivia had curled up in the armchair with a book, though her eyes weren't moving across the page. Harper sat on the floor beside Rose, who clutched her teddy bear tightly, her small fingers gripping the worn fabric as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Ethan watched them from the doorway, his heart heavy. He knew they were all thinking the same thing. Tomorrow, a judge would decide their fate. Would they stay with him? Or would Charlotte somehow convince the court that she deserved another chance? The thought of losing them made his chest tighten painfully. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Movie night?" he asked, trying to inject some normalcy into the evening. The girls exchanged glances, hesitant, but then Harper nodded. "Can we watch the one with the talking dogs?" Ethan smiled. "Of course." They piled onto the couch, Melody finally picking up her sketchbook, Olivia leaning against Ethan's side as she slowly turned the pages of her book. Ava remained near the edge of the room, watching, always watching. He let them stay up later than usual. They needed the distraction. But when bedtime finally came, the tension returned. Rose hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, her tiny hand gripping the banister. "Will we still be here tomorrow?" she whispered. Ethan knelt beside her. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, brushing her hair back gently. "No matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere." Rose nodded, but she didn't look convinced. As he tucked them all into bed, Ethan lingered by Ava's door. "You okay?" he asked softly. Ava sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to believe it's over. I want to believe the judge will do the right thing." She looked down at her hands. "But I don't trust it." Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't either," he admitted. She turned to face him. "If she wins, if she takes us back, will you fight for us?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'll never stop fighting for you." Ava studied his face for a long moment before nodding. "Okay." That was the last word spoken that night. The next morning, the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Ethan sat at the front with Ms. Bennet, his hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The girls were seated a few rows back with Mrs. Ellison, their expressions tense but composed. Charlotte sat across the room, her lawyer whispering last-minute arguments in her ear. She looked different today, calmer, more composed, but her eyes darted around the room, her fingers tapping anxiously against the table. The judge entered, and the room fell into complete silence. She adjusted her glasses, flipping through a thick stack of documents before finally looking up. "This has been a complicated case," she began. "Both parties have presented compelling arguments, and I do not take my decision lightly." Ethan held his breath. The judge continued. Ms. Haynes, there is no doubt that you have made efforts to rehabilitate yourself. You have completed the necessary therapy, attended all required sessions, and demonstrated a willingness to change. Charlotte straightened slightly, a glimmer of hope flashing across her face. However, the judge said, her tone firm, change does not erase the past, nor does it guarantee the safety and well-being of the children involved. Ethan felt a surge of hope. These children have been through extensive trauma, the judge continued. They have found stability in Mr. Carter's home, and removing them now would be a direct threat to their continued healing. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of Mr. Carter retaining full legal custody. A sharp, choked sound came from Charlotte's seat. She covered her mouth with her hands, her shoulders trembling. Ethan barely heard her. The relief that crashed over him was overwhelming. He turned in his seat, his eyes immediately finding the girls. Harper had clasped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Melody let out a quiet gasp, while Olivia clutched the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. Rose's lower lip wobbled as she processed the words, and Avenue Ava was staring straight ahead, unblinking. Then, slowly, she exhaled. Her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time since he had met her, the tension that had always lived in her posture seemed to ease. He had never seen her look so free. Tears stung his eyes as he turned back to the judge. "Thank you," he whispered. The judge nodded, then looked at Charlotte. "Ms. Haynes, you will be granted supervised visitation privileges should the children wish to maintain contact in the future." Charlotte barely reacted. She simply sat there, staring at the floor, her breathing shallow. Ethan didn't wait for anything else. He turned, moving toward the girls, and the moment he reached them, they collapsed into his arms. Rose buried her face in his chest. Harper's arms wrapped around his waist, and Olivia clung to his sleeve. Melody sniffled quietly, hiding her face behind her sketchbook. And Avenue Ava hugged him. Really hugged him. Not just a hesitant, cautious gesture, but something real, something full of meaning. And for Ethan, that was everything. Charlotte was escorted out of the courtroom shortly after. She didn't look at them as she passed. As they walked out into the bright sunlight, Mrs. Ellison patted Ethan's arm. "You did good," she murmured. He swallowed past the lump in his throat. "We did good." That night, the house was filled with warmth. Pizza was ordered. Music played softly from the speakers. The girls laughed, talked, and, for the first time, truly celebrated. No more shadows. No more fear. Harper climbed onto Ethan's lap, her small hands pressing against his cheeks. "We get to stay," she whispered, as if still trying to believe it. Ethan pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You get to stay forever." Later, after the girls had gone to bed, Ethan sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling. He had done it. They were safe. They were his. And they always would be. Somewhere, deep in the house, he heard Ava whisper to her sisters, "We're home." The days that followed were filled with something unfamiliar. Peace. The fear that had settled in the house like a second skin began to fade, slowly replaced by something lighter. The girls no longer flinched at unexpected noises. Harper slept through the night without waking up crying. Melody's drawings transformed from shadowy figures into bright landscapes and dreamlike portraits of people smiling. Olivia started spending more time outside, no longer afraid of the open space beyond the backyard fence. And Ava still checked the locks at night. She still watched the street from the front window sometimes, her fingers tapping against her thigh in nervous habit. But the weight in her shoulders was different now, lighter, relieved. She no longer carried the burden alone. Ethan noticed all of it. He also noticed how the girls had started calling the house home in casual conversation. How Rose had taken to running through the front door every day after school shouting, "Dad, we're home!" without even thinking about it. How Ava had stopped keeping a packed bag under her bed. One evening after dinner, Harper climbed into Ethan's lap, playing with the buttons on his shirt. "Can we do something special?" she asked. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Something special?" "Like a family thing," Melody chimed in. She tapped her pencil against the kitchen table where she had been sketching. "Something to celebrate," Olivia hesitated. "Like a vacation?" Ethan chuckled. "Well, maybe not a full vacation just yet, but how about a weekend trip somewhere? Just us." Ava looked up from her book. "Where?" "Anywhere you guys want," Ethan said. "Somewhere fun." Ava exchanged glances with her sisters. "The lake house," she finally said. Ethan blinked. "Lake house?" Melody nodded. "We went there once, a long time ago, before everything." Ethan leaned forward. "You want to go back?" Ava hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." And that was that. The following weekend, they packed up the car and headed for the mountains, toward a small cabin Ethan had rented near the lake. The drive was long, filled with music and laughter and arguments over which snacks belonged to who. Rose fell asleep halfway there, curled up in Harper's lap while Olivia read quietly in the back seat. When they finally arrived, the girls tumbled out of the car, taking in the view of the water. It was still early spring, the air crisp and cool, but the lake shimmered under the afternoon sun. Ethan watched as they ran toward the shore, kicking off their shoes and letting the water lap at their toes. Even Ava smiled, nudging Melody playfully as they waded in. That night, they built a fire by the water. Ethan grilled burgers while the girls toasted marshmallows, their laughter ringing out under the vast night sky. At one point, Ava sat down next to him, staring into the flames. "This feels different." Ethan glanced at her. "Different how?" She shrugged. "Good different." He smiled. "Yeah, it does." Later, as they all sat together watching the stars, Rose yawned and curled up against Ethan's side. "Dad?" Ethan's heart clenched, the word still sending a thrill through him every time he heard it. "Yeah, sweetheart?" "Do we have to go back?" she asked sleepily. He chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Eventually, yes." She sighed dramatically. "But why?" "Because that's home." Rose thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but can we come back here too?" Ethan wrapped an arm around her, looking out over the water, where Ava and Melody were skipping stones. "As many times as you want." When they returned home a few days later, everything felt more settled, more permanent. But there was still one last thing Ethan needed to do. The following week, he sat Ava down in his office. "I want to talk to you about something important," he said. Ava frowned slightly, crossing her arms. "What?" Ethan took a deep breath, pulling a small stack of papers from his desk. He slid them across the table toward her. She hesitated before picking them up, scanning the first page. Her breath caught. The words stared back at her. "Legal adoption petition." Ava's fingers tightened around the paper. You want to adopt us?" Ethan nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "Only if that's what you want too." She didn't speak for a long moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the papers down. Then, without warning, she threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around him in the fiercest hug he had ever received. "Yes," she whispered against his shoulder. "Yes." Ethan's eyes burned as he held her close. That afternoon, he gathered all the girls in the living room. "I have something important to ask you," he said, kneeling in front of them. "I know that we've already been a family in every way that matters, but I'd like to make it official." He pulled out 5 small boxes, each containing a necklace with a delicate infinity symbol engraved on the pendant. "Would you let me adopt you? Make it legal? Make it forever?" The response was immediate. Harper launched herself into his arms, nearly knocking him over. "Yes!" she squealed. Melody wiped at her eyes. "Of course." Olivia nodded, a rare, shy smile breaking across her face. Rose clapped her hands. "Forever?" "Forever," Ethan promised. Ava, sitting quietly, reached for her necklace. She turned it over in her fingers, staring at the symbol for a long time before looking up. Forever, she repeated softly. The adoption process took months, but when the day finally arrived, it was perfect. They stood together in the courthouse, all 5 girls lined up beside Ethan as the judge smiled down at them. "I have to say," she remarked, flipping through the paperwork, "this is one of the happiest cases I've presided over." Ava stood the tallest, her shoulders straight, her head held high. When the judge stamped the final papers, she glanced up at Ethan. "It's official," she said. "You're stuck with us now." Ethan chuckled. Wouldn't have it any other way. Afterward, they went out for ice cream, piling into a booth at their favorite diner. Rose got chocolate all over her face. Harper talked a mile a minute, and Melody sketched little doodles on napkins. Ava sat beside Ethan, silent for a moment before leaning her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" he asked. "For not giving up on us." Ethan swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Never," he promised. And he meant it. As they drove home that evening, the sun setting behind them, Harper played music through the car speakers, singing loudly and off-key. Olivia rolled her eyes but smiled. Melody doodled on her wrist with a marker. Rose curled up with her teddy bear. Ava watched the road ahead, the corners of her mouth turned up ever so slightly. And Ethan? Ethan looked at them, his daughters, his family, and knew they had finally found their forever. The warm glow of the dining room lights cast soft shadows across the table as Ethan watched the girls chatter excitedly over dinner. Harper waved her fork animatedly, nearly knocking over her glass of milk as she told a story about a squirrel she had seen on the school playground that day. Rose, giggling, reached for her teddy bear, holding it up as if it were just as invested in the conversation. Charlotte sat at the far end of the table, listening quietly, her hands resting in her lap. Though she had been visiting for months now, there were still moments when she seemed hesitant, uncertain of her place in their lives. As if sensing this, Melody turned to her, holding up her latest sketch. "I drew this today," she said, sliding it across the table. Charlotte picked up the paper carefully, her breath catching. It was a picture of all of them sitting together, smiling, gathered around the very table they sat at now. Ethan was in the middle, Harper and Rose on either side of him, Olivia with a book in her lap, Melody sketching, and Ava standing behind them all, watchful as always, and beside them, Charlotte. Her eyes burned with emotion as she looked at Melody. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "You're so talented." Melody's cheeks flushed slightly at the praise, but she nodded. "I wanted to draw something that felt real." Charlotte swallowed hard, glancing at Ava, who had remained silent through most of the evening. But Ava was watching. She had seen the way her mother reacted to the drawing, the way her fingers trembled as she traced the edges. A long moment passed before Ava finally spoke. "You should take it with you," she said, her voice even but gentle. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly. Ethan held his breath. This was the first real invitation Ava had extended, the first sign that maybe, just maybe, the wounds between them could truly begin to heal. Charlotte hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Thank you." The tension in the air lightened just a little. Olivia began talking about a book she had just finished, and the conversation flowed back into the easy rhythm of family life. Ethan exhaled, allowing himself a small smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The months continued to pass, each visit bringing small but meaningful changes. Charlotte started arriving early, helping Harper with her school projects or listening to Olivia read. She sat beside Melody as she sketched, offering quiet encouragement. She even helped Rose learn how to tie her shoes, patiently demonstrating until the little girl could do it on her own. And Ava watched. She observed every interaction, every moment of kindness, every effort Charlotte made. She still held back, still kept her guard up, but there was no denying the shift in her demeanor. One afternoon, as Charlotte was getting ready to leave, she hesitated at the front door. "Ava," she said softly. Ava, who had been sitting on the couch flipping through a magazine, looked up. Charlotte swallowed. "I know I don't deserve your trust yet, and I may never fully earn it. But I just want you to know that I'm trying." Ava studied her mother for a long moment. Then finally, she gave a small nod. "I know." Charlotte exhaled, blinking rapidly as if fighting back tears. "That means more to me than you know." As she walked out the door, Ethan caught the look in Ava's eyes, something softer, something hesitant, but not entirely closed off. And in that moment, he knew. She was finally ready to let go of the past. On a crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves crunched under their feet, the entire family gathered at a pumpkin patch for their first real family outing together. The air was filled with laughter as Rose ran ahead, her tiny boots kicking up dust as she searched for the biggest pumpkin in the world. Harper chased after her, giggling, while Melody and Olivia wandered between the rows, discussing which pumpkins would make the best canvases for their carving contest later. Ethan walked a few steps behind Ava and Charlotte, watching as they navigated the space between them. "You know," Charlotte said softly, "I still remember when you were little. You used to love coming to places like this." Ava glanced at her, skeptical. "Yeah?" Charlotte nodded. "You'd always pick the ugliest pumpkin because you thought no one else would want it. Said it deserved a home, too." Ava blinked. She had almost forgotten that. Charlotte smiled faintly. "I didn't understand it then, but I do now." They walked in silence for a moment before Ava spoke again. "Maybe I'll find an ugly pumpkin today." Charlotte's breath hitched slightly, but she smiled. "I'd like that." Ethan felt his heart swell at the exchange. They weren't there yet, but they were closer than they had ever been. Thanksgiving arrived with the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey filling the house. The girls crowded into the kitchen, each helping in their own way. Harper setting the table, Olivia stirring the gravy, Melody decorating the pumpkin pie with careful swirls of whipped cream. Rose sat on the counter beside Ethan, helping by stealing pieces of bread from the stuffing mixture. Charlotte stood near the doorway, watching with a soft smile. Ethan caught her gaze and gestured toward the counter. "Want to help?" For a moment, she hesitated, but then she stepped forward, rolling up her sleeves. "I make a pretty good cranberry sauce," she admitted. Ava, who was arranging the centerpiece, smirked. "We'll be the judge of that." Laughter filled the room. When they finally sat down for dinner, the table was full, not just with food, but with warmth, with love, with something that had once seemed impossible. As they passed plates and shared stories, Ethan caught Ava watching Charlotte. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with something else. Something like understanding. And maybe, just maybe, something like forgiveness. That night, as Ethan tucked Rose into bed, she looked up at him sleepily. "Do you think Mommy will always come back now?" Ethan brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I think she's trying really hard to be here," he said honestly. Rose nodded, yawning. "That's good." She drifted off, her small hands clutching her teddy bear tightly. Ethan lingered for a moment, watching her, his heart full. As he stepped into the hallway, he found Ava leaning against the doorframe. "You okay?" he asked. She shrugged, but there was something lighter in her expression. "Yeah." She hesitated, then looked toward the staircase. "I think I might go help Mom with the dishes." Ethan smiled. "I think she'd like that." Ava nodded, then turned and walked away. Ethan exhaled, leaning against the wall. For so long, this family had been built on survival, on holding on to each other in the face of everything they had endured. But now, they were building something more, something stronger, something lasting, something real. And for the first time, Ethan truly believed they had found their way home.